I wanted to picture a headline from 2025, and honestly, if you had shown this to a trade economist 10 years ago, they probably would have laughed at you out of the room. And here it is. India became the #1 exporter of iPhones to the United States. Not China, India. So let that sink in. For the very first time in history, a factory in Tamil Nadu had performed the manufacturing giants of Shenzhen, and people celebrated it, rightfully so. It felt like proof that India was finally stepping into its moment as a world's next great manufacturing power. But here's the thing, there's a twist buried inside the headlines, and it completely changes the story. In the exact same year India hit that milestone, its trade deficit with China didn't shrink, it grew. It grew to a record $112 billion. Think about what that means. India is assembling more iPhones than ever, shipping more finished devices to America than ever, and sending more money to China than ever just to make those phones. So how is that even mathematically possible, you may ask? How do you export one of the world's most valuable consumer products and somehow end up more dependent on your biggest competitor at the same time? The answer comes down to two words that people use interchangeably but mean completely different things: assembly and manufacturing. Because what India is doing right now is primarily assembly, and there's a massive difference between assembly and manufacturing. Let me give you an analogy. I think it makes this click. Imagine you take credit for baking an incredibly expensive wedding cake, but you bought the cake mix, the frosting, the decorations, even the baking pans, for example, from the baker down the street. You're doing the final work, you're putting it together. But someone else made all of that ingredients, and someone else is capturing most of the profit. That's exactly what's happening here. It looks like independence, but underneath, it's a deeper form of dependency. Those workers in Tamil Nadu are physically assembling iPhones, but those factories are almost entirely dependent on Chinese components, Chinese equipment, Chinese material. That's why the deficit grew from $99 billion to $112 billion. The more India manufactures, the more Chinese part it needs to do it. If you trace the life of an iPhone assembled in India today, it starts with China. The items like toughened glass, the camera module, the precision aluminum frames, the battery, the chemistry, the advanced electronics, none of that is easy to produce. It's the result of decades of investment in metallurgy, precision engineering, material science. China makes all of that, ships it to India, India assembles the final product, and China still walks away with a substantial share of the profit. So how did China build that kind of advantage in the first place? Because it wasn't always manufacturing giant we know today. Starting in the late 1970s, China made a single, relentless bet. It would become the factory of the world. At its peak, China was reinvesting nearly half of its entire GDP back into itself. Infrastructure, industrial development, new cities, new ports, new railways, half of GDP for 40 years. Over roughly 30 years, China moved 300 million people from farming communities into cities to work in factories. That's nearly the entire population of the United States, relocated to build an industrial economy. It's the largest and fastest industrialization in human history. Nothing comes close to that. But here's the part that people miss. It's not just the factories China built, it's everything around them. Imagine a specialized machine on an iPhone production line breaks down. You need a specific replacement part and a trained technician for that machine. In an Indian factory today, that part and that technician might both need to come from Shenzhen. That's days of downtime. But in Shenzhen, the part is manufactured a few streets away. The technicians arrive in an hour. That's what an industrial ecosystem looks like. The network of suppliers, the precision tool makers, the logistic companies that delivers critical parts overnight. The 4 decades of accumulated knowledge that you cannot copy and paste. India isn't competing against another country. It's competing against a system built over 40 years. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because despite China's enormous head start, India's momentum is undeniable. Apple assembled 55 million iPhones in India in 2025. 5 years ago, that number was 0. By the end of 2026, Apple plans to source the majority of iPhones sold in America from India. And Apple isn't alone. Samsung, Google, they're all moving production into India. Because after COVID, after trade wars, after all of it, the world's biggest companies decided you cannot put everything in one country. And then there is a factor that no policy can manufacture: demographics. India's median age is 28. However, China's median age is 38. 65% of Indians are under 35. India's working age population keeps growing for the next 25 years. China once had this exact window. It used every single year of it. So India is winning, right? Here is where it gets uncomfortable. Despite all of it, the Apple factories, the incentives, the record exports, India's trade deficit with China didn't fall. It actually grew. From 99 billion to 112 billion in a single year. The more India tries to manufacture, the more Chinese part it needs to do it. That is not independence. That is a deeper version of the same dependency. And it points directly to the three wall India keeps running into. When an iPhone is assembled in India, only about 19 cents of every dollar of value was actually credited in India. In China, that number is closer to 45 cents. India has the assembly line, China has the supply chain. And until India builds its own component ecosystem, the chemistry, the precision tooling, the materials, every iPhone it exports is quietly subsidizing the competitor it's trying to beat. This one is almost never talked about, but it actually matters. In China, iPhone factories run on 2 12-hour shifts. In India, labor law caps shifts at 8-hour, which means Apple suppliers needs 3 shifts to match the same output. More shifts, more workers, more handover, and more cost. That's quite natural. That's not a cultural difference. It's written into the law, and it makes every Indian factory structurally more expensive to run than Chinese one. Wall 3 is actually an uncomfortable one. Imagine this. China could decide overnight to build a semiconductor city in middle of nowhere. 3 years later, it would exist. Land cleared, power connected, workers housed. Imagine doing that in India. India cannot do that. Building infrastructure in India means land battles for one state at a time, regulatory approvals spread across ministries, political negotiations with 28 state governments. And look, that's not a failure. That is the real price of democracy. A real price that shows up in factory costs, in delays, in the gap between ambition and execution. China, however, chose speed. India chose accountability. Both choices have consequences. So, where does this leave us? India is not failing, let's be clear about that. It's assembling more iPhones than ever. It's the world's fastest growing major economy, and it has a demographic window that China would genuinely trade anything to have back. But winning the assembly line is not the same as winning manufacturing. China didn't get here by assembling other people's product. It got here by building the parts, the tools, the machines, and eventually the design themselves. The journey took 40 years. The question for India isn't whether it can copy that path. It can't, it really can't. And it probably shouldn't try that as well. The real question is whether India can build enough of its own supply chain, its own components, its own industrial depth to stop spending the profits back to countries it's racing against. India has 25 years of demographic dividend left. China had the same window. It used every single year of it. So I want to know what you think. Is India on track to become a genuine manufacturing power by 2040? Or will it stay in the world's assembly room while China keeps the real money? Drop your answers in the comments. And if this breakdown changed the way you think about that Made in India label, you know what to do. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next one.